Mr. Ben Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be able to lead this debate about the effects of the drug Mamba on society, which is a growing issue both in my constituency and across similar towns around the UK. Mamba, also known as Black Mamba, is one of several synthetic cannabis products which have emerged onto the drugs market in recent years. Members might also have heard of Spice, which is originally a brand name for a version of synthetic cannabis. And these drugs contain a herbal smoking mixture that's been mixed with a group of drugs known as synthetic cannabinoid receptor agnostics, or SCRAs for short. Spice and Mamba are now used as nicknames for any type of herbal mixture that has been coated with an SCRA. They were sold as legal highs until the Psychoactive Substances Act came into force in 2016. So this is a very recent challenge, which perhaps explains why we seem to be fairly unprepared for dealing with it. Mamba and Spice were initially seen as an alternative version of cannabis, but as I go on to mention later in my speech, they bear a closer resemblance to harder drugs such as heroin. The name synthetic cannabis is in many ways really unhelpful, as it draws comparisons with cannabis that are largely untrue, and the impact is certainly far worse for both individuals and for communities. These drugs are often known as zombie drugs for the terrible effects that they have on their users. After consuming Mamba, users often resemble zombies, slumped in a state of semi-consciousness, sometimes foaming at the mouth, sometimes passed out in the streets. Tom in my office has literally given CPR to drug users in the street outside my office on multiple occasions when they've passed out in the street during broad daylight, working hours. It's a huge strain on the police, ambulance and hospital services, as well as Tom's nerves as well. The drugs vary wildly from drug to drug and even from batch to batch. They're often made by small-scale producers, so the quality is incredibly inconsistent and sometimes dangerous. I know that many of my colleagues and members across the House will have similar issues in some of their own constituencies, and this is a national problem affecting towns.
The 10 o'clock motion, the whip to move.
I beg to move this House do now adjourn.
The question is this House do now adjourn? Mr. Ben Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just as I was getting into my flow. This is a national problem affecting every corner of the United Kingdom. But in Mansfield town centre, like many around the country, we have a persistent and growing problem with these drugs and the individuals that take them. Users tend to congregate in town in very public places. They consume Mamba and then stay in the town centre for hours in a semi-comatose, zombified state. It's awful to see, has a terrible impact on users and a knock-on effect on the whole town and across society. It's no exaggeration to say I receive an email or a message from constituents on this issue literally every single day. I will take an intervention.
Mr. Speaker, I thank congratulate the honourable gentleman bringing this forward. As always, he picks a subject which is very important, as he rightly says, across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. With Spice, as he referred to earlier on, being as addictive as heroin, does the honourable member not agree that it must be treated with the seriousness and also with the sanctions which we have with heroin trafficking?
I thank the honourable member for that intervention. I absolutely agree, and I'll come on to later in my speech exactly why that's the case and some of what I hope will be remedies to the issue that we currently find. This comparison with cannabis in particular I don't think is fair or realistic, and actually it is more comparable with heroin and important that it's treated in the same way, that both users and people experiencing this in the town centre get the same level of help and support as those addicted to heroin. I'm keen to use this opportunity to ask the government to undertake a number of actions on this issue. First and foremost, I'm concerned about the classification, coming back to what my honourable friend has said. But before the ban on psychoactive substances in 2016, these drugs were sold either over the counter or online under a variety of different brand names. They're often seen as a new version of cannabis. I'm pleased that government's banned them and other legal highs, but I'm concerned we've not gone far enough. They're incredibly dangerous, they destroy lives, and they're very clearly damaging my community in Mansfield as we speak. Mamba is highly addictive. The withdrawal symptoms of things like Mamba and Spice are said to be worse than coming off cocaine or heroin. I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. Would you agree with me that the development of a new test for detecting Mamba is something that is of enormous value in the fight against this drug?
Thank you for the intervention. I absolutely agree that there don't seem to be medical interventions into Mamba in the same way as there are with other drugs, which I'll come on to later on. But absolutely, being able to diagnose the cause of this zombified state will be a very important thing, and that potentially help police and local health services if that were possible. Anecdotally, I've heard from constituents who have tried to overcome their Mamba addiction by moving on to heroin, because they say it's easier to deal with. There's more support, more medical intervention to help them quit heroin. than there is for Mamba, which just goes to show, I think, that these are not comparable with cannabis. This is a hard drug that will give way.
Briefly, I wonder what you'd comment on the fact that in countries like the Netherlands, where cannabis has been legalised, there is no demand for Mamba or Spice or any of those products.
I think the comparison with cannabis is not a fair one. I think the challenge with these drugs, particularly, is the affordability of them as it is. They are illegal, but you can still get multiple hits for a £5 in the town centre. And actually, I think the legalisation of them, they were legal before, of course, and perhaps we didn't see the backstreet issue that we have now, but the growing strength and poor quality of these drugs means that actually they're a growing health problem for many constituents. I will give way again.
At the very point, because they're illegal now, we've driven them underground, we've put them in the hands of the criminals are making them, we don't know what quality they're coming out at, and therefore people who could be taking legal cannabis would be happy taking legal cannabis have been driven into the hands of criminals, taking a product they've got no idea what's in it, and it's having the effects you've so eloquently described.
Intervention. I think the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that cannabis is a totally different thing to these particular. Whether there is an argument for legalising cannabis further down the line, and different models exist around the world, and I'd be happy to discuss that. But I think the point I'm trying to make this evening is that these are far worse in terms of their impact than cannabis. And I certainly don't think we should go back to a scenario where these particular drugs are legalised. I think that will present huge challenges. The users frequently suffer seizures, vomit, have terrifying hallucinations, severe psychotic episodes. The seeing people in our town centres slumped against walls or hovering in this zombified state is horrific. It's awful for the users who have literally lost control of their functions, in desperate need of intervention and support. And it's also awful for other people in town as well. I've had the experience of trying to explain to my 3-year-old son that the man on the floor isn't dead, he must be tired, he's asleep, he's whatever. You can easily understand why families contact me on a regular basis having had that experience and then don't choose to return to Mansfield Town Centre as a result. As well as considering reclassification, we also need a more joined-up strategy to help towns deal with these issues. And we need greater help from the health service in terms of support programmes and help for users that exists for other drugs like heroin, but not for Mamba and Spice. Let me be clear, I'm not under any illusion that this is a simple issue. It's clear the effects on society are far-reaching. They touch upon a number of governmental departments. But since being elected last year, I've focused on some of these issues locally, particularly homelessness in Mansfield and Warsaw. The individuals that take these drugs are often facing their own personal crises, family breakdown, homelessness, other addictions or mental health problems. I'm keen to look at the ways in which we can care for these individuals who are homeless and vulnerable. They need assistance, and I want to take the opportunity to pay credit to the charities, support workers and volunteers that help Mamba users in my constituency and around the East Midlands. Relatively local to me is the Nottingham Recovery Network, and the network run a series of Mamba clinics in Nottingham to help users across the city. I'm due to meet Neil Brooks, a clinical specialist who works in connection with the network, next month in order to learn more about his work and to speak directly to former Mamba users. And Neil was kind enough to brief me on his work ahead of the debate today. He's broadly supportive of a campaign to raise the classification of Mamba from Class B to Class A, and is also keen from government to look at the ways in which it can support detox programmes for Mamba users. The Nottingham Recovery Network has produced a series of notes which outline the situation locally and provide a useful insight into these drugs, which after all are relatively new on the scene. The notes paint a bleak picture. I'd like to take a couple of minutes just to look in more detail at the current situation locally. There's no national figures for emergency hospital admission for spice-related incidents, but it's likely to be several thousand admissions a year. Not only is Mamba one of the cheapest drugs on the market, it's also one of the strongest. In its pure form, synthetic cannabinoids, that are either solids or oils, they're then added to herbs, vegetable matters, plant cutting to make a smoking mixture, so it looks like cannabis. But a key feature of Mamba is the compound acetone. Dealers frequently use nail polish remover, which is used to bind the liquid together to the herbal plant matter during the production. As well as giving it a distinctive smell, it causes a variety of physical problems for Mamba users. And what's even worse is that dealers and producers are frequently adding more and more acetone to the product to make the Mamba stronger. Alarmingly, the extra acetone content actually leads to the cost of the drug declining, making it more affordable for people, but obviously much more dangerous. It continues to drop in price from £60 to £70 an ounce to now regularly selling for £40 to £50 an ounce or even lower. The price of a bag bought in the streets remains about £5, typically for 4 hits. So you can understand why it's becoming the drug of choice for hard drug users. It's also having an impact on our prison, and unlike traditional cannabis, Mamba and Spice have a much lower odour, making it difficult for prison staff to tell when inmates are smoking the drugs. There are already considerable pressures on the prison system, of course, but the prevalence of these drugs makes it even more challenging for prison staff. Going back 5 years or more since first reports of these kind of drugs in prisons came about, it hasn't been solved. And even worse are cases where prison staff, nurses, other support workers have encountered the drug by accident, including inhaling second-hand smoke in prison. The drug's so potent that the effects of inhaling second-hand smoke can be quite significant. We need to take it seriously. It's not a slightly harder version of cannabis or a recreational drug that users occasionally dabble in. It's becoming the more affordable version of heroin. It's a hard street drug of choice for users because of that affordability, and it's making towns like Mansfield into places that people don't want to visit, never mind the personal impact on the users themselves. I'm asking the Home Office to consider reviewing the classification of these so-called zombie drugs, because the current classification, in my view, does not reflect the truly dangerous nature of these substances. Changing the classification would mean tougher penalties for manufacturers and dealers. Go on.
Consider the fact that if you raise synthetic cannabis to classification A, then what you're doing is you're saying to the criminals who handle this, you're going to be hammered down on this. We're seeing it as a more destructive. And therefore, what they're going to do to protect their marketplace is increase the levels of violence they use on their people in their marketplace to protect them and the people around them, which means the most vulnerable people, yet again, are going to be the people who are most punished by this move.
I'm not sure I agree with him. I think the availability of these drugs, they're so easy to find. I've literally come across bags of it lying in the streets in my town centre, just abandoned there. And I think part of that problem is because the people dealing it, taking it, don't see the consequences of where they are. There are very few legal consequences, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in my speech later on, about some of the challenges of people going round and round the system because of this drug. Making it a Class A drug would mean, in my view, that it would become more of a risk to deal it. As a result, supply would decrease, prices would rise. But it would also crucially give the police greater powers to prosecute offenders and to get dealers and users off our street and out of town centres, whether that's support services, rehabilitation, or in some cases, prison. I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. I think it's very important to see where the Honourable Gentleman is going and what he says. I fully support what he says. And it's quite clear that we need to have legislation in place to prevent this drug destroying lives, destroying futures for many people. And it's not sufficient to say that we legalise it in some places, that makes it better. It doesn't. We need to legalise it, we need to proceed to go forward with making sure that it's not legalised, and thereby we make sure that people don't have access to it.
Intervention, I agree with him. I think in many cases, particularly with this, and I want to draw the difference again between these drugs and cannabis, as we've discussed. I do think they are totally different propositions, and whether there is an argument for the discussion about legalisation of cannabis, obviously a hot topic at the minute, but I don't think these drugs fall into that category. I think these are genuinely issues where there is not enough legislation, there is not enough consequence to taking these drugs as they exist. And if you've seen the impact in town centres, as it sounds like the Honourable Friend Opposite has, the impact that this is having on Mansfield in particular is horrendous to see. Go on, one last time.
Going with the logic you're following here, you want to crack down on this in the same ways we've cracked down over the years on other hard drugs. And that's hardly been a raging success, had it? All we've seen is the escalation of drugs on our streets. That's why they're so readily available, because they're in the hands of criminals and we don't know what's in them. Coming down hard on vulnerable users and the low-level drug dealers does not stop or interrupt the flow of hardline drugs to our streets by any more than a couple of hours. They're back in there, they're doing it again. All you're doing is playing it into the hands of the criminals.
I think improvement as intervention, I think it has to be about all sides of the support. There has to be a legal line to be drawn. There has to be ramifications to the taking of these drugs. There also needs to be support services. There needs to be medical intervention. And as I've touched on, the medical intervention for these kind of drugs don't exist in the same way as they do for heroin and others. What's becoming increasingly apparent to me in Mansfield Town Centre is that the users of this particular drug see no legal consequence to literally walking through the streets shouting about having taken it in front of families and children and whatever, and they're in and out of prison, as I'll touch on later on, with no consequence. But if you can go round and round the legal system without any ultimate price to pay. And if you are a homeless person, actually sometimes a bed in a prison is better than your normal situation. I think we have to come at this from all angles in terms of support, policing, medical intervention and various aspects that can help to deal with this situation, because it certainly can't be allowed to carry on as it is, although I fully appreciate the point that the Honourable Member is making. I think it's also vital that we get this message across in schools. Obviously, we talk about drugs in schools, but Mamba is relatively new, it's dangerous, and to stop people from experimenting in this drug in the first place, we need to make sure that people are aware of that. Whilst the zombified images of users are bad enough, and they are flowing around my constituents' Facebook pages as we speak, let's not forget they can also be deadly. In March, the death of 7 men in Birmingham were linked to Mamba, and it's not just adults. Children are now accessing these substances, and the examples I've read have been terrifying. Earlier this year, an 11-year-old in Wales smoked synthetic cannabis and ended up in hospital in a high-dependency unit for 33 hours while doctors dealt with the effects it was having on his young body. And although toxicology reports are still pending, it's believed a 14-year-old boy from Greater Manchester died earlier this year after taking Spice while having a sleepover in his house with friends. He died at the intensive care unit at Alderhay Children's Hospital in Liverpool. It's horrendous that we have children dying after taking these drugs, and local police in my constituency tell me they're concerned that more and more children are now associating themselves with groups of Mamba users, and that this could become a heightened risk over the summer holidays. These are drugs that share the same classification as cannabis, but which have far more severe side effects. Having sought the advice of local services, charities and also from the local police, I know stakeholders from all sides are broadly supportive of the idea of reviewing the classification of Mamba and other synthetic drugs. Policing, of course, of this issue is largely managed at a local level, and in June I met Inspector Nick Butler, the neighbourhood policing inspector for my constituency. It was good to discuss how they are tackling this locally. He outlined in some detail his concerns about policing Mamba and the effects of Mamba usage on crime levels more broadly. In the past 12 months, the town centre in Mansfield has seen a 22% rise in antisocial behaviour, a 34% rise in shop theft, and much of this relates to street drinking and Mamba use. There's a persistent group of offenders in the town centre which consists of around 20 people, many of whom are heavy drug users. And the police know these individuals well. They have regular reviews of their cases. The police and support services are there, and they're trying to deal with the problem, but in my view, without the ability to take tough action and without a national framework or best practice for them to draw upon. I think it'd be helpful to members to hear an example that was given of a local case that police in Mansfield dealt with recently, and perhaps to evidence my view that there does need to be more legal ramification for this, as we discussed before. I've obviously anonymised what I'm about to say, but I think it illustrates why we need tougher action on this issue. In Mansfield, a male resident Mamba user repeatedly threatened and assaulted shop staff, district council staff and police within the town centre. This went on for a year. He carried weapons like flick knives, he wouldn't listen to advice or engage with any of the agencies providing support. In fact, he became verbally abusive if support was offered. He'd then take Mamba and other substances in the town centre on a daily basis and become extremely abusive. He'd often collapse, which would require ambulance call-out. The ambulance would arrive, he'd threaten to assault paramedics, and a criminal behaviour order was obtained with the condition he was not allowed to enter Mansfield town centre. But what happened? He breached the order immediately. He was arrested and placed before the courts. This happened 4 times. He was warned on each occasion by the magistrates not to breach the order again, but on each occasion he'd walk out of court straight into the town centre, showing a complete disregard for our legal system. The next time he breached the order, he was placed before the court and given a £10 fine, but the magistrates also amended his order to allow him to visit a church in the town centre where he said he needed to access support services. They didn't consult the church on this, and they weren't happy, to say the least. After this hearing, he immediately breached the order again, and on leaving the court was given a suspended 21-day sentence. Having breached the order for the 8th time in 4 weeks, he was in prison for 30 days. And he's once again returned to the town centre, continues to abuse members of the public. He's been arrested again, and the court's now bailed him pending reports. This case makes it only too apparent that offenders can breach these orders over and over and over again, just how difficult it is to deal with these persistent offenders. But my local police can't figure out what else they can do beyond these criminal behaviour orders and moving people out of the town centre. We need to take action to change this. The police currently, it seems, limited in what they can do when the courts can't or aren't willing to implement tougher penalties. Aside from this case, I've also been contacted by a large number of constituents who've raised their concern about the impact this is having on our town centre. I've been contacted by staff from local shops, including independent shops and larger companies like even Wilkinson's in Mansfield. Shop staff have raised concerns about the threats that they receive at work. The level of shoplifting has risen, as I mentioned the statistics earlier on. This is having a real impact on the profitability and viability of stores in the town centre. I will give way.
A project run by John Marks back in the late 1980s, where he was giving medical cannabis out, medical heroin out to addicts, and the crime rate there dropped by 96%.
Aware of that. I would not get into any position where I would advocate the giving out of heroin to my constituents. I don't think many of my constituents would go along with that either. I'd be very interested to read and see the science behind it. But I'm not, I don't think, ever likely to condone that kind of action, if I'm being honest. The shop staff have been raising with me these concerns about the threats they receive at work. The level of shoplifting has also risen, as I mentioned, and the threat of violence, possibility of business closures, are causing understandable stress for retail workers locally. And they don't deserve, frankly, to have to deal with Mamba zombies as part of their daily work. The government's working on a number of things to support our high streets and town centres, but this good work can be so easily undermined by the presence of these hard drug users in our town centre. I explained before the experience I had with my children of walking through town and trying to explain to them exactly what was going on with this drug use. Mansfield has great potential in its town centre, independent shops, listed buildings, a lovely market square, amazing people, but I'm concerned that the persistent group of drug users in the town centre is already putting people off, and that this reputation of the town is going to continue to grow unless we take action. I've already touched upon some positive steps being taken locally to coordinate the approach between local police, outreach support workers, local housing associations. It's good news too that Mansfield District Council now has a specialist team to tackle drug-related antisocial behaviour in the town centre. The purpose of this debate is to highlight the impact that this is having on local communities and also to lobby the government for change. I'm keen that more action is taken to address this problem at a national level. I've been in contact with the Home Office about Mamba in recent weeks, and of course I welcome the variety of actions that have already been taken to deal with the misuse of these kinds of drugs. The Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016 came into force and of course banned these substances. Hundreds of retailers across the UK have closed down or don't sell these drugs anymore. Police have arrested suppliers, and the National Crime Agency has removed many of these substances from UK-based websites as well. So there has been action. It's a good start, but we need to review, in my view, the classification of these drugs. We also clearly need a national strategy and support from central government to help tackle this issue, which is not confined to Mansfield. It is a national problem. There's so many town centres across the UK experiencing very similar problems. I've heard from other members in this House not so long ago about similar issues that they've experienced in their own constituencies. I think a national framework is required. I'm calling on government to work with local police forces, with councils, with charities, experts, to put a framework in place which helps towns and cities to deal with this problem effectively, gives police and local councils some advice to call upon in terms of how to deal with this on a local level. It's a relatively new problem with its own specific challenges, and the approach has been mixed because I don't think there is this national plan to draw upon. While there's great examples like the clinic I mentioned, the Nottingham Recovery Network, the reality is in many areas, police forces, councils, charities are having to deal with this without effective guidance and without the frameworks to make sure that there is a collaborative, cross-organisational approach to managing this. I also think we need to investigate what medical interventions might be possible. It's easy to talk about drug users as a problem, but obviously many of them have their own personal issues, terrible personal circumstances that have led them to this point. It's not, as far as I can see, a medical approach like there is with methadone with heroin users. It's not something I've raised as the substance of my debate because obviously the Home Office are answering, and that's more of a health department point. So I won't go into that now, but I hope that he'll consider it in his actions going forward. To finally summarise, and then I will sit down, what I'm asking from government this evening is to create a national strategy and framework which includes clear guidelines and advice to help those that are dealing with these drugs. If the Minister could talk to his colleagues in the Health Department about those medical interventions that might be available. And most importantly, I think, to consider reclassifying this drug as more comparable to heroin and cocaine than it is to marijuana, and to give the police the opportunity to deal with it in that same way. It's an incredibly serious problem, and one I think we need to address head on.
Yeah. I call the Minister, Nick Hurd, to reply to the debate.
Mr. Speaker, since being elected, my honourable friend has been a tireless champion for the people of Mansfield, and I congratulate him on securing debate on an issue that is clearly causing a great deal of concern in Mansfield. And as he quite rightly points out, it's a concern shared across many town centres, reflected in a recent Westminster Hall debate on exactly this subject. And I have seen for myself on the streets of Newcastle out on patrol with the police just what a damaging effect and an unsettling effect these so-called zombie drugs have. And as he points out, these are also drugs that are linked to deaths, according to the ONS 27 in 2016. So we're talking about a very serious issue, although as he stated very clearly, it is a relatively recent challenge for us, but it is a growing one, and one that I hope I can assure him that the government takes very seriously. We're not going as far as he would like at this point today, but it is a subject which we keep very regularly under review, because we're very aware about how dangerous these drugs can be and the devastating impact they can have on communities, families, individuals take them, and how unsettling they are for communities as well. As he pointed out, they are often more potent than cannabis. Their effects are not well understood. Batches vary in strength, making it easy to use too much. Using these drugs can cause immediate side effects such as panic and hallucinations, long-term harm such as psychosis and dependence. That's why, as he pointed out, we acted to control these substances as Class B drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act and give the police the powers they need to take action, including making possession illegal and providing longer sentences for dealers. I'm not going to take interventions because he took out a long period of time from my honourable gentleman in his bed, and I've got a very short of time to pay my honourable friend sufficient respect to his speech in this response. As he pointed out, as my own friend pointed out, the use of new psychoactive substances has fallen significantly since we introduced the Psychoactive Substances Act. And thanks to this legislation, again, as he pointed out, hundreds of retailers have either closed down or are no longer selling psychoactive substances, and the first offenders have been convicted. He expressed a note of scepticism about police powers, but while there were 28 convictions in England and Wales, with 7 jailed under the new powers in 2016, this rose to 152 convictions, with 62 people immediately sent to custody in 2017. To his central point, Mr. Speaker, which is his desire, shared by other colleagues in the House, and I'm thinking particularly of our mutual friend, the Honourable Member for Torbay, to see synthetic cannabinoids such as Mamba and Spice reclassified from Class B to Class A drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. I understand the argument he's making specifically around wanting to introduce more risk into the dealing of these highly dangerous drugs. I think he will appreciate that the controls we have put in place are relatively recent. They are being monitored. The impact of them is being monitored closely, and the government does rely heavily on advice from the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs. And while its position at the moment is not to reclassify as synthetic, I've already told the Honourable I'm not giving way to it because I'm responding to the debate. While its position at the moment is not to reclassify synthetic cannabinoids, I can assure my honourable friend quite genuinely that the government will continue to keep an eye on this area and will continue to engage with colleagues who've got a deep concern of this. In the absence of that decisive move that he's arguing for, again, as he pointed out, the key in the short term is the cross-sector partnership work at the local level. And I'm aware of the approach that's been taken in Mansfield, which he quite rightly praised, and the work that the police there have undertaken along with other agencies to tackle problems with the use of these drugs. He talked about the need for a national framework. He may or may not be aware that the National Policing Lead for Drugs has provided forces with operational guidance, setting out tactical options for dealing with synthetic cannabinoids. And but I will keep under review the need for broader sort of national guidelines in terms of best practice in relation to cross-partnership working, which is the key here. In his area, the police, as he knows, work closely with partners This includes the Drugs Monitoring Group, identifying general drug problems and emerging trends in Nottinghamshire, the Professional Information Network, which shares intelligence and learning among partner agencies in the area about emerging substances, including Mamba, and policing to disrupt the supply and distribution. I'm also aware of a problem profile that has been drawn up by Nottinghamshire Police about these drugs that the Honourable Member may be aware of this. On top of this, Mansfield, along with Nottingham, Rushcliffe, Gedling, Broxtowe, Ashfield, Newark and Sherwood and Bassetlaw are receiving £370,000 over the next 2 years to provide a Nottinghamshire rough sleeper prevention service. He will know of the clear links between these drugs and rough sleeping, and this will help rough sleepers access other support services, including substance misuse services. Another very good example of multi-agency working is what has taken place in Manchester, where they commissioned a study to really understand the scale and nature of the problem in the area, and a multi-agency approach there appears to be working, which includes enforcement work, tackling the dealing of these drugs, working with treatment services to ensure synthetic cannabis users are receiving treatment, increasing the numbers of trained outreach workers, fast-tracking users into a range of services, and local voluntary sector support to police and ambulance services. So I commend the work of Manchester and the work in Nottinghamshire and Mansfield in this area. He talked. I made the connection with rough sleeping. Because increasing use of synthetic cannabinoids among rough sleepers reflects the fact, as he points out, that it's cheaper, stronger and more accessible than other substances such as heroin, crack cocaine or alcohol. So local strategies must include strategies in relation to rough sleeping, and as he knows, the government takes this issue very seriously as we bring forward our rough sleeping strategy later this summer, which I think is an important contribution to this. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Mansfield again for securing this adjournment debate on a very important topic. I hope it made it clear the government is not sitting on our hands in this matter. We recognise this matter is best tackled by working collaboratively, and this is seen across government. There's no overnight solution to this. The set of measures I've set out shows the strong links between the use of synthetic cannabinoids and vulnerable groups, and this government is determined to take the necessary action to get on top of this growing problem.
Order. The House stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.